Hi there, and welcome to episode 8 of the Educators Corner podcast, the show that brings you conversations with educators from all over the world. Conversations where we stay curious for a little bit longer about the issues, challenges, and opportunities which we are facing in our schools and in our communities. So whether you're walking, running, cooking, or just relaxing, I hope that you're ready for a compelling conversation with today's guest, Mark Steed. In this second episode of a two-parter on the Global Teacher Recruitment Crisis, we're going to look at some of the more innovative solutions that might help us embrace this, what we called in the first episode, this charging rhino that's coming towards us in schools all over the world, that's been out there in the distance waiting to charge us for quite a few years now, and it now feels for many of us in schools that we're facing this charge head on. So we're going to look at some innovative solutions to the charging rhino, and I'm really delighted, Mark, that you've found time in your very busy schedule to join us for episode 2 of this second parter. How are you, Mark? How are you doing?
Oh, it's great to be here. We've had, obviously, I've been out to the Middle East since we last did this, and we spoke together at the BSME conference, so it's nice to be back in the UK.
Fantastic, and great to have you back with us. I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation today. We released the first episode of this two-part back on the 4th of March, and then we did a joint presentation on this topic at the BSME annual conference on the 7th of March. So that's about 3 weeks ago now. So, Mark, any particular reflections since we launched the podcast and the conference that maybe you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, Kai, we had a really interesting discussion. What we did in that session was obviously to set up some discussions, and what came out of it, my big takeaway, was that this is already happening. Some people are already struggling to recruit. Some people are already coming up with innovative solutions. And, one of the heads in Dubai, for example, said they were already considering sharing teachers with other schools in their group for specialist subjects and so on. So we're already seeing this challenge of finding top teachers for schools. And, we've known it's going to charge this rhino, but it's well on its way.
For me, what it's reiterated, in particular for my own school, is that I have been discussing this with my board for the last 5 or 6 years as a strategic risk, and we have had a couple of strategies, 3-year strategies, we call them employment strategies, which have looked at a number of areas to try and deal with this rhino that's charging towards us. And I guess the feedback I got from that conference, there seems to be a lot of interest in the importance of using the data that we've shared, that we've all got access to into our schools, to work with that data and to discuss with our boards and our owners a strategic response to this. And so we are now working through our next 3-year employment strategy, which I'm expecting the board to sign off next October and November. And that's not really changing that much to the previous 3-year strategies we had. And in the first episode of this podcast theme, we were talking first of all about terms and conditions and also CPD as being really important planks in an employment strategy of this kind. Have you any further reflections or any more thoughts there, Mark, on what you think might need to be in a 3-year strategy? If you were back in school, what else might you be doing?
Well, I was really interested to see what your approach was there, and to learn more about it in terms of all those different planks. But we've got to look at retention, so there's obviously the sort of financial remuneration aspect to that, and we've also got to young people, particularly some of the younger staff, really are very keen on professional development and promotion opportunities and these sort of things. So you've got the retention piece, and the sort of recruitment piece is really around creating a really strong employer brand. And I think, I've always said, put as much effort into, your recruitment of teacher strategy as you do into your student recruitment strategy. And I think that approach just is probably tipping more to the importance of recruiting staff at the moment. But it does come down to having a really strong employer brand and having a very good reputation out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a key sort of plank for our first 2-3 year employment strategies. We knew and we understood we had to spend even more time and energy and creativity promoting the school right across the world. And like I said, that is certainly not going away. We've done a lot of work on that. And I think what I'm thinking even more now is once you've recruited staff to your school and you have to spend so much time and energy recruiting staff to your school, it's perhaps even more important as recruitment gets more difficult to be able to retain those staff. And the idea of loving the one you're with, I think, is more pertinent than ever. So I think, and certainly CPD and having a really engaging program of CPD that develops a range of colleagues, and also thinking very much about employee well-being, I think is a big part of holding on to staff. And I think something which we're becoming more intentional about, I think, in the last couple of years, is even when staff then decide to leave, thinking very carefully about the off-boarding strategy. Because if you end on love with your colleagues or your sort of ex-colleagues to be, then there is a chance they actually might come back to you at some point as well.
I mean, yeah, and I think we went to a stage, we at Kellett, we set up an alumni organisation for the staff, and they meet regularly online, and, people stay engaged with people in terms of having discussions. We used to bring best practice. It was great to get involved with staff, former staff who are working in different contexts. They became critical friends to the school, but also there was this engagement, recruitment, retention, and people looking to come back or pass on a good word about the school, that it's still in a good shape, and so on. So I think that offboarding, keeping in touch, keeping that relationship going, and I think to consider your former staff a potential source of future staff, I think is really important.
And it's interesting the number of colleagues who have maybe shared stories in other schools or organisations they've worked with, and when they've told their school or their organisation that they're leaving, they then feel they're ignored, or they're given the silent treatment, and clearly that's not going to be a particularly helpful off-boarding strategy. I think what I'm also finding, and what we're finding here in Oman, is we feel we've got a fairly robust recruitment strategy. So marketing's strong. We've got a very competitive terms and conditions, salaries, benefits, and so on. We have been investing a lot of time and energy and money into CPD. We've been thinking a lot about well-being and various other elements as well. And despite all that, we are now in a position, as I explained in the first podcast, that, for example, we're phasing out German because we found it so hard to recruit German teachers. We have found it pretty hard, but I think we're just about there, recruiting PE teachers also this year. And we did actually place an advert for a physics teacher a few months ago, and we pretty much got zero response. And unfortunately, we didn't have to recruit a physics teacher. But we know that when we do that, it's going to be really difficult, despite our employment strategy. So I think really the next piece I'd like us to explore, Mark, is when schools like mine, schools like the ones you've been leading, any school around the world, gets to a situation where they simply cannot employ a specialist teacher. And it seems to be this is very much a secondary or senior school issue at the moment. Primary seems to be okay. But when we simply cannot employ a teacher, what's our plan B?
Well, I think you're right. It's not a primary issue. I mean, I think there's greater flexibility in terms of where primary staff can be deployed, and it's very good for their professional development that teachers teach in different key stages and year groups. But that doesn't really apply with the specialisms in senior secondary schools. I think one of the things, I'm working with a number of schools in the UK on this at the moment, and one of the things that they're exploring is using online tutoring and as part of their curriculum. And there are companies now who will provide a tutor who will teach the 8 lessons a week for GCSE A level, if you like, at the same time that you're timetabling it. You'll get the same tutor for the 2 years of the course, or that's the intention, and certainly in the same way, the same guarantees that you'd have in a school for continuity of teaching. And also, they would do your reporting straight into your MIS, and they would do parents' meetings. So effectively, the only thing is different is that the student would go, rather than going to the next classroom, would go to a study area, and they would log on, perhaps with 2 or 3 other peers for a short, sort of shortage subject. Or specialist, deeply specialist subjects. Some of the languages, Latin, Greek, some of these sorts of subjects are being explored. And then the tutor would teach them remotely, but during the timetable. And I think that flexibility is a really good solution if you can't find a specialist teacher.
I can imagine in schools across the world that if a head teacher or a school leader mentions to maybe their colleagues, or mentions to their board or their owners, or mentions to parents that we're going to replace some of our teaching with online teaching, I can imagine the reaction from many quarters will be negative, perhaps based on the press, the experience that many teachers, students, families had during COVID. How do we sort of counter that negative press that online teaching, online learning got in COVID? Did it deserve that reputation? What are your thoughts on that? How, as a leader, how would you counter that sort of negative reaction to we're going online with physics or ancient Greek or Latin or German next year? And they say, you must be joking, Mr. Steed. That was terrible in COVID. Why on earth do we want to go back to that situation?
Well, I don't think the actual teaching and learning piece during COVID in remote teaching was that bad. I mean, I was running Kellett at the time. We ended up getting phenomenal results, even though we spent 60% of the year in 2022 we were teaching remotely. So I think what was lost during COVID was the personal interaction, the being in school, all the community activities, the socialization of students, and those sorts of things. But sixth form students particularly, I think, enjoyed being able to just to sort of get up, log on, have the lesson, and then be at home, and that you had got all that saved time of not travelling. And I think the other aspect around this is looking at it from the teacher's point of view and the supply of teachers' point of view, is that there's a limited pool who are willing to work 5 days a week, 8:30 to 4:30 in a school anymore. But there is a significantly larger pool who would be willing to work from home. And so there's this untapped resource of teachers who for whatever reasons, willingness or actual ability, cannot commit to doing 5 days a week, but who would work remotely. And I think that side of things needs to be explored. And when we look at the sort of global teacher recruitment crisis, you've got to say, well, look, why aren't we tapping into this group of highly qualified, in many cases very experienced teachers who could do a great job teaching remotely?
And if I can add to your earlier point, really about the bad press that maybe online teaching got during COVID, there was an interesting survey released by McKinsey in June last year, where they surveyed, I think, nearly 20,000 higher education students who had just left their senior years of school education behind now in university. So they would have been experiencing that senior education, that sixth form, or that post-16 education during COVID. And 65% of those students wanted some of their degree course to be online. They could see the benefits of the flexibility and the way that would help them engage with learning as well as face-to-face teaching. So I think that's quite interesting from the student's perspective. And then I think you're also aware we've got our partner school down in Salalah, and since 2020 we've been running a hybrid program which was conceived before COVID started, and a third of the teaching is face-to-face, a third of the teaching is online, and a third of the experience of the students is independent study. And that seems to work really well as long as you have teachers who are absolutely committed and thrive in an online environment. And online teaching is not for every teacher. But there are many teachers, and like you say, there are a lot of teachers who maybe currently aren't employed by schools, but who could work remotely and could thrive and could really engage students in an online environment. And so when I think you create the right conditions for online learning with the right teacher, maybe it needs to be in school. That's certainly our parents in Salalah were very keen that their students were still in school, whether they were doing online or face-to-face. And also with the right support in the classroom, certainly for maybe younger students, then our experience in Salalah is it can be, I think as you've just explained, Mark, it can be at least as effective, if not even more effective, than face-to-face teaching, certainly for some subjects and perhaps for older students. So I think it's really interesting that really we might be, I guess, like a lot of innovations, being forced into a different way of working because of the circumstances we find ourselves in. But if you think about the scenario where, say, we've already been there in the last few months with trying to recruit German staff, you can phase subjects out of the curriculum. That's another response. But if you can't phase a subject out of the curriculum, or you don't want to do that, I don't know what other solutions we can find if we simply cannot recruit a specialist teacher for secondary school students.
Well, I suppose one option is to try and make the resource that you've got go further. So I know there's a MAT in Essex which is running a pilot at the moment, which is where a teacher is in a room, or effectively a very big recording studio. It's got 90 screens, or students. You can take 90 students at one time, who are themselves in 3 classes, with effectively a TA supervising each class. And the teacher teaches to the camera. It's obviously it's a technological solution. The students can watch the teacher logging on with their personal device. And the teacher can effectively teach 3 classes at the same time. And it's not, this isn't the same as, sort of teaching, sort of one-to-one or in a normal class. You haven't got the same level of personal interaction, but it's better than nothing. And I think this is where, I use the analogy that we've gone through. It's as if we've spent a whole life flying in business class, and you've turned left all of your life, and you're used to sitting there and the extra comfort and having the canapes and the drinks brought to you, as you go. And then somebody says you're going to have to fly a bucket airline. You're going to go, well, that isn't really what it's all about. But if the alternative's not flying at all, then actually the bucket airline solutions is pretty good. So I think we're going to have to slightly recalibrate here. We're going to have to say, actually, the model we've got of a teacher standing in front of 20, 30 students, with a specialist degree and a specialist teaching qualification is actually a premium luxury product. And we're not going to be able to do that all the time. So I think people will have to recalibrate. And, this sample, this experiment, this Matt is running in Essex is, I think, a sort of an early adopter of what might be a technological solution to the problem.
Mark, you talk about recalibrating. Perhaps a phrase we could also use is reimagining schooling or reimagining education. And sort of recruiting a remote tutor or some online teachers sounds a bit like substituting the live teacher for a remote teacher, and we're now doing that in pretty much the same format and the same design of schooling that we've had for decades. I think what's also fascinating for me is how through online teaching and online learning, there are schools now which are being reimagined, or schooling is being reimagined. So let's talk first about online schooling. So not just the odd teacher here and there beaming into a school teaching online. We seem to be having a proliferation of schools since COVID, certainly in the UK, of online schooling. And if you want to sort of see how this is expanding, there's a chap called Jonathan Lloyd on LinkedIn who's been documenting the number of online schools that are proliferating across the United Kingdom at the moment. And I think the last time I looked at that document, there were at least 20 online schools. So is education going to be reimagining through online learning, or is this just a niche redesign for a very small number of students? What are your thoughts on these online schools that are emerging, Mark?
Well, okay, so Clayton Christensen, who is the Harvard professor, sadly no longer with us, who did all the research on disruption and had a particular interest in his later life in schooling. His argument is that disruption begins at the margins. It begins in sort of low, very marginal, low sort of volume areas, specialist areas, and then moves from those, up the food chain, as it were, and becomes normalized. And we can see this. I mean, Kai, we obviously, know Melissa McBride, who runs Sophia High School. And this is the first online DFE school, licensed by DFE. And it's initially working with students who are school refusers, people who are moving out of home learning into a sort of online school environment. But you could see that moving up into and becoming more mainstream as time goes on. I mean, that's the model that Christensen puts forward, and I think it'll be very interesting to see, particularly track these online schools and see how much traction they get, and interestingly, which markets they move into. We can see that taking over the homeschooling market or the school refuser market is sort of, it is at the margins of education. And I say that not denigrating those students in any way, but it could move into the mainstream.
And certainly, I mean, homeschooling in the UK and in the United States has been growing significantly over the last 15 or 20 years. And just in the last month, actually, two colleagues that I was talking to at the BSME conference in Doha just 3 weeks ago were telling me how these two different colleagues, very, very different parts of the world, their child was homeschooling, but actually in both cases, their homeschooled child had enrolled onto an online school. So we've already been seeing the growth of homeschooling in the last 10, 15 years. And now that is maybe being supported and possibly fueled by this increase in online schooling. And what's also, I guess, fueling it as well, or supporting it, or is helping this movement towards online schooling. And you talked about this in the last podcast, Mark, about the increase in adults now, I guess, increase in parents who are at least spending some of their working week at home. They're working flexibly, they're working at home. So the need for the school to provide this haven of sort of childcare as a primary function, for some families, for some of the time, is less of an issue. So as we see these changes in society, and I guess as we see the changes in technology, and as we see an increase, maybe discontentment with maybe state schooling and an independent schooling is maybe unaffordable for most people or many people, that homeschooling and maybe online schooling, like you say, it looks like that's set to continue growing, certainly in some parts of the world. So from your point of view, that might be a niche offer at the moment, but you think it's going to continue growing?
I do, and I think it's very easy to look at this debate from a sort of Western sophisticated business class sort of model. But I mean, one of the other factors here we've got to look at is that there's 250 million children in the world who don't go to school. And if you actually, from a global perspective, say, well, what's the biggest problem in education? It is undoubtedly that there's 250 million children who don't go to school. Now, a solution for those those students down the line might be wholly online education. The Sujatra Mitra hole in the wall sort of project that he obviously did in India is an indication that actually this sort of learning can be very effective. Now, obviously, there's a sort of digital divide. At the moment, there's a huge gap between the haves and the haves not only in terms of access to technology, but also to connectivity. But if we step back and say, look, 10, 15 years ago, if people had said to you that mobile phones would transform commerce in Africa, people would have said, you're mad, absolutely mad. But in practice, that's what's happened. Mobile phone technology is, transforming the way that business is done in Africa. And so, if it's possible in that context, why not? If we roll forward another 15 years, 20 years, the idea that we might educate vast numbers of students around the world who at the moment are a sort of part of those missing millions, then, I think is quite an exciting option. And I really do hope that, technology can be rolled out and connectivity can be rolled out that will give, people in the developing world greater access to education. There's got to be a great vision there, isn't it?
Fantastic vision, and that would be a wonderful silver lining if that movement towards making sure that every child in the world is engaging with some form of education. If that actually starts with the teacher recruitment crisis that's fueling it or partly fueling it, that would be a great silver lining to that crisis. And I guess one of the other silver linings that we've been talking about is that online schooling, or at least having some of your teaching your school in an online way, that does create a more flexible way of working for some teachers. The next thought then is, does it have to be entirely bricks and mortar schooling, or does it have to be online schooling? Is there perhaps a blend of these two models, which I think you're particularly interested in, Mark? You've written about hybrid schooling. So where we've got partly bricks and mortar, I think partly online, the hybrid school. What does the Steed Academy or the hybrid Steed Academy look like in 5 or 10 years, do you think? Paint a picture of how you see a hybrid school working.
Well, I'm a great fan of hybrid. I think it's a really efficient and it's got a lot of traction, but it does have a bricks and mortar element to it. So students do go to school, and they have face-to-face lessons when they're at school, and those lessons might not be all the subjects. So you might focus on the subjects that need to be done in specialist facilities like design technology and art and sport and those sorts of specialist areas. I mean, what you do in a normal classroom, which takes up most of the real estate of a school, it can almost certainly be done online and taught remotely. So I have a picture where students would go to school 2 or 3 days a week. Teachers would go to school 2 or 3 days a week, which would sort of mirrors the wider society. This, I think, will solve the teacher recruitment crisis, because there's a lot of people, if you offered them the flexibility to be in the office 3 days a week, which is effectively what a lot of the city boys are doing at the moment, then that would then take us into a competitive market for graduate recruitment. I think we'd be able to focus on community activities, tutoring, support during that time at school. Now, obviously, there's a number of objections to that model. I think that there are families where they haven't got the home environment, either in terms of childcare or in terms of access to technology, where people are going to have to be in school. So I think that the option to be in school 5 days a week should remain. But let's say Mondays and Fridays, for the sake of argument, the students go to study areas, they log into their online lessons using school equipment at school. There is supervision very loosely done by teaching assistants. The lessons are delivered online. So students can go 5 days a week, and they can have access to technology at school if they haven't got it at home. But there is the option to work from home on a Monday and a Friday. And I think this will then create a very different model. I think it will take it won't have the deficiencies we saw during COVID home learning, because there will be a sense of community, there will be assemblies, there will be community activities, there will be face-to-face engagement to check that students are working hard. But at the same time, it will allow us to sort of, as a profession, and move to a model that matches wider society.
Absolutely fascinating. Just to be clear on a couple of points, your vision for the Steed Hybrid Academy is for secondary students only, certainly at the moment. You're thinking this is for older students?
Yeah, I totally buy into it. And, that younger students aren't going to be able to access online learning in quite the same way. We saw that during COVID. The younger the child, the more support they needed. The lessons online remote working didn't work so much. They needed the socialization of being in school. We're still living with the consequences in school of that lack of socialization coming out of COVID. With people report anecdotally that students are not as mature at every level that they were before. So I think there is primary schools have an immensely important function in terms of developing strong learners and strong human beings and socializing young people. And the childcare aspect, is there for the younger ones in the way that it isn't in quite the same way for the older students. So my model is very much for secondary, and I think we will have to find different ways of being more flexible in terms of staffing, for primary schools, and that probably will effectively be something a bit like a job share model. And people will do that in that way. But we have to bring flexibility to the profession.
Okay, and you're acknowledging, it would seem, in this senior hybrid model, the Steed Hybrid Academy, that we're still acknowledging the importance of socialisation. So drama, art, music, maybe science, practicals, sport, all these sorts of subjects. Students would be in school, engaging with each other in some really interesting spaces, special spaces for those subjects and those experiences. And then some students will be at home for maybe Monday and Friday in a typical week, online, learning online. But for those students for whom a home environment is not suitable, then they would be provisioned for them to do that learning in school as well. So that seems an interesting dream. How close to that reality, or how close to that dream do you think we are in reality at the moment? Are there any examples you've come across that are starting to move and operate in that way?
Yeah, there are. I mean, there's a tutorial college in Oxford, for example, Green's Tutorial, which is a sixth form school. It's hybrid. Students come in 3 days a week into the school. They study online. Nearly all of their tuition is done online. They've got labs in the physical space. I mean, the beauty of this model is that it allows schools to have a significantly smaller physical footprint than current schools. If you think about how many normal standard classrooms you've got, around your school, you can effectively lose all of those because those subjects are going to get taught online. And then you can end up with a very coherent sort of, teaching and learning spaces for specialist subjects like, music, art, drama, and so on, sport. And then you've also got community spaces like, auditoriums and, places where people meet. The library, learning space, think Starbucks rather than, sort of the British Library, sort of type thing, that sort of space, interactive, where students can study, I think is really important. So you could totally re-envisage what schools look like, and they become sort of, to some extent, social spaces. They're for social activities. And I think really interestingly, the thing that got me into IT many, many years ago was a book written in 1995, which is, I guess, quite a long time ago now. And it was a book by Nicholas Negroponte, who was the head of the media lab at MIT. And he's got a few throwaway lines in the book about what schools are going to look like in the future. And he talks about them being social spaces. What a phenomenal, that book is so worth reading, Being Digital by Nicholas Negroponte, because it's prophetic. And he paints a picture, and he's talking about wearable tech. He's talking about this in 1995. This is quite extraordinary. But this idea of schools as social spaces and that learning takes place elsewhere, was envisaged by him, 30 odd years ago. So very exciting sort of model. And I think we're beginning to see it. And I think hybrid's a really good sort of model because it's the best of all worlds.
And I think, schools are social spaces. I mean, if you ask, students at the end of maybe a long summer holiday or any holiday, are they looking forward to coming back to school? They very often are. Not necessarily because they want to go to the maths lesson or the geography lesson. And they might want to do that. But they're so keen to connect with their friends again in the social space that school already is, I guess. And I guess, answering my own question, thinking about, are there little bits of this model that are already out there? Well, there are already schools that, for example, when it's raining or there's bad weather, they continue online. If the students aren't in school, learning doesn't stop just because school maybe closes. There are schools who run, if you like, parents' evenings or parent evening type days, and they let the kids work at home, so the staff have got space to engage with the parents without the students being in school, that sort of thing, and that also gives more flexibility. So I think there are, like you said, Mark, there are ingredients of hybrid that are starting to show us where the world might be going. And I think, if you just go back to the 1944 Education Act, and I think there weren't that many types of schools back then. There was the tripartite system, wasn't there? There were technical colleges, there were secondary moderns, there were grammar schools, and then there were independent or private schools and state schools. If you just look at now, 2024, the different types of schools we've got academies, we've got free schools, we've got foundation schools. There's already a far more diverse landscape of schooling out there. We've got all through schools, we've got preschool, primary, secondary, further. But what I think we are starting to see now, that we're having different types of school categorized by the way in which they deliver schooling. So we've definitely still got our bricks and mortar in all those different formats, but we've now got online schooling. That's definitely a thing. We've got homeschooling. That's definitely a thing. And it looks like we're going to see the emergence of hybrid schooling. And I guess if I'm looking at this positively, looking at this future landscape where you've got a much more diverse range of schools available to meet a much more diverse range of young person. And isn't it a good thing that if, as our education systems evolve, that we have a multitude of options for young people, which might mean, a bricks and mortar school might be right for them at one point in their development, but online schooling might be right at another point, and then maybe homeschooling at another point. And having that diversity, haven't we got more opportunity then to meet more needs of more young people than we've ever done before? And so while there might be drawbacks and issues, overall, isn't the direction of travel positive for young people's education?
Yeah, I'm very excited by the variety. I mean, I think there will always be. I mean, I'll bring this down to, let's bring it down to economics. I mean, governments and parents, whether they're paying through taxes or through paying independent school fees, are paying an enormous amount of money for education. So it will come down to cost at the end of the day as well. And, the sort of hybrid model, is not going to be for everyone. There will always be, Eton will always be Eton. It will do one-to-one in the way that it does. Independent schools will offer that sort of premium product, which is, the sort of traditional view of the classroom of, 20 kids, with a specialist teacher in front of them. But that's a very expensive model of education. And then hybrid is a really, flexible model. It's actually a relatively cost-efficient model that combines some of that online aspect that might be, as you do at Al Salala, you've those three elements that you've got there of face-to-face and online and individual study, which again is an area that will get much, much stronger as we get AI-driven personalized learning systems coming together. So these three elements will be, I think, the majority of students in the world will study in hybrid. The sort of traditional model will be a luxury product, and then there will be a sort of budget model, which is wholly online. And as much as one wants everybody to have a sort of Eton style or a top independent school education, it isn't practically affordable and it isn't scalable. So we do need these other models. So I think it's quite an exciting thing. And when I talk about hybrid, I'm really talking about the fact that this is going to become, I think it will probably be the norm for the provision provided by governments across the world. I mean, America's heading this way, Britain will head this way, Europe will head this way. And then perhaps, when we end up with, the sort of mass centres in the Far East, these mass cities, again, there may be a bit more online learning in those communities.
And then the teacher recruitment crisis, where we started this conversation, coupled with advancements in technology, particularly AI, plus changes in society in terms of home working, we seem to have a convergence of forces here, which are taking us to that much more diverse education model, which is going to benefit students because there's going to be more diversity for them to choose from. And it also could see significant benefits for the workforce in terms of more flexible models of schooling means more flexible models of working.
Absolutely, and I don't see a model where we can have flexible working and working from home for teachers if we don't have an element of hybrid in the sense of a combination of bricks and mortar and online teaching. So I think that, as you say, it's a convergent sort of discussion. And there are many, many more people who would be willing to stay in the profession or join the profession if there's greater flexibility. That's just the nature of things. And I think that people want flexibility. They're seeing it in other professions. Education has to become more competitive to sort of at least dodge this charging rhino.
Mark, we're coming towards the end of the second episode of this two-parter. So hopefully you've got energy for what we're now calling the bottom lining round. So you did a quick fire round in the first podcast. We've got a series of questions for you, 7 questions, where we're asking a bottom line response. So where you're just keeping to the essence of your answer. So it might even be a one-word answer that we're satisfied with. So here we go. Bottom lining round number 2, Mr. Steed. Question 1. Are you missing being in school?
Yeah, schools are great places.
Second question. Will you ever go back to school as a leader or teacher then?
Well, actually, Kai, I'm going to next year. I'm doing. I've been appointed as the interim principal of Stamford School in Lincolnshire. It's a boarding and day school, so I'm going to be running that for a year. Really excited about that as an opportunity. Great to be back in school, and yeah, very excited by going back into school for a year.
Congratulations! Sounds a fantastic opportunity. Third question. You've worked in the UK, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. For someone who's considering a change of career, which of those areas would you recommend and why?
I would go Middle East because I think it's so exciting, it's innovative, there's risk taking. Although there's a lot of inspection, it happens so often that it sort of just becomes part of the routine. I think schools are well resourced. There's, the weather's fantastic. Middle East.
Question 4, Google or Microsoft?
Microsoft every time. It's great. I love it. It all fits together. Works well.
iPhone or Samsung?
iPhone.
Question 6. It's been a big year for movies. Well, 2023 was a big year for movies. What was your favourite movie of 2023?
Oh, definitely Oppenheimer. I taught Hiroshima and Nagasaki when I was a religious studies teacher. It's an amazing story. It was beautifully. The Christopher Nolan version was really interesting. I think it got into some of the moral dilemmas that the whole project involved. Great movie.
And finally, you've been a school leader for more than 20 years, I think 22 years, and you're about to start your 23rd year next year at Stanford. So what one piece of advice would you offer to any aspiring school leader?
I think it's about mastery at every level. I think you become a better leader if you master being a teacher. If you gain mastery as a head of department or subject leader, if you gain mastery in a pastoral role, I think there's a danger that people try to move up the chain too fast and don't get mastery at every level, and you become a much better leader. So whatever level you're at as in your career, however ambitious you are, you need to nail it at that level, and then move on to the next, and then nail that, and then hopefully you'll be a much better school leader at the end of it.
I would agree with that. So it's time for us to say goodbye, Mark. Thank you once again for joining us for a second episode of the Educators Corner podcast. For listeners out there, if you are interested in the discussions Mark and I have been having around the global recruitment crisis and ways in which we can manage and lead our schools through those times and through these times in even more effective ways, such is the interest in the discussions we've been having that School Management Plus have commissioned Mark and I to do a series of 6 short-ish, 10 to 12-minute episodes on different aspects of teacher recruitment from both a UK school and international school perspective. So have a look out for those coming up soon. So we're going to carry on the conversation. And if there are certain areas of questions that you'd like us to address in those episodes with School Management Plus, please contact Mark or myself on LinkedIn. You'll find us there, reasonably active from time to time. And it's always great to engage with other educators and leaders and teachers around the world around these very important issues. But for now, we're going to say goodbye to Mark, and thank you so much for joining us for a second episode of the Educators Corner podcast. And good luck with your new role at Stanford.
Thank you, Kai. It's been wonderful to be on the show, and always good to kick ideas around with you, and very much looking forward to getting back into running a school.
Take care. You've been listening to the Educators Corner podcast, the show that brings you conversations with educators from all over the world, the podcast where we stay curious for just a little bit longer. The Educators Corner podcast is hosted by me, Kai Vasher, and produced by Stuart Pardoe, Zoe Snell and Marion James, and by BSM BSS Productions.